All right. I'm going to start now. So, thank you all so much for joining. And for those of you who were here for this last year, welcome back. I'm Gabriella. I'm locations editor at Screen International, and I'm also editor of Screen International sister site, Screen Global Production, which, just to give you a brief rundown in case you don't know, is a site dedicated to global production, anything from production services, incentives, studio development, and international production in all its various forms, film, TV, and commercial. We have a weekly newsletter, so I'd love it if you all sign up because I think it's quite good, in my totally unbiased opinion. And along with me today is Joe Stirling Lee, consultant from Olsberg SPI, and we're doing our hopefully annual Be on the Screen webinar. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe to give us some more details on what the webinar is going to be about. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm just sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, so welcome back to our, as Gabriella said, hopefully our annual production incentives webinar. My name is Joe Stirling Lee. I'm a consultant at Olsberg SPI. And yeah, the plan is to run through a short deck on trends in global screen production incentives. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So just to give you a quick idea of what I'll be discussing in the deck. I'll just quickly talk about Olsberg SPI and the company and what we do. I will just touch on what this webinar series is and where this fits in. And then I'll move on to some global incentive trends. So this will cover kind of big trends that we're seeing across lots of different programs this year. And then I'll go more specific into some notable updates in individual countries or with individual incentives. I'll then move on to some ongoing development, so things that we're seeing that aren't in place just yet, but are maybe being legislated or coming in next year. And then, as I said, we'll have a Q&A at the end. And so please, if anybody has any questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them. So very quickly on Olsberg SPI, we are a independent consultancy based in the UK, but working globally on film and television or screen sector strategy and policy projects. So we do a lot of work with public sector clients and as well as private sector clients. So that could be governments or studios or kind of industry associations. On lots of different areas of screen production and production policy, including kind of workforce development, skills development, studio infrastructure, broader sector strategies, and of course, production incentives, where we do a lot of work on developing policies and designing policies. And then with existing programs, we do a lot of work on assessing their impact and evaluating them. So that's Olsberg SPI. These are some of our past clients. And this is our third webinar in our Beyond the Screen series. So this year, my colleague Emma Openshaw ran a webinar on what we call the ripple effect of production, which is looking at expenditure by film and TV production in other areas of the economy. And of course, we had our first webinar last year on production incentives. So thanks everybody for joining this webinar. And I'll move on now to the trends. So we're seeing by our count this year, there are 120 production incentives in operation worldwide. This is the same as last year. So one of the trends that I'll come on to is how, particularly this year, we're seeing kind of the expansion of existing incentives as opposed to lots of new incentives. But you can see since 2017 that there's been a huge rise in the number of incentives worldwide across all parts of the world, really. Most of Europe, pretty much all of Europe now, in terms of countries, they have incentives. Most US states and Canadian provinces have incentives, and we're seeing more and more programs being introduced in Latin America and the Middle East and across Asia. So they've really become the most popular policy tool used by government for stimulating production all around the world. And so, yes, as I mentioned, one of the big trends that we're seeing this year is, rather than lots of new incentives, we're seeing kind of some of the major existing programs being expanded. So I'll touch on some of the specific examples, but I'm sure people have seen in California that there was a major expansion of the incentive there, and New York and Ireland and the UK also had some potential changes. So there's lots of these, well-established programs that have attract a huge production volume already, being adapted or enhanced or amended in some way to stay competitive. The other trend that we're seeing is an increasing focus on local feature films, and kind of the small scale productions within an industry. So from our perspective, working on these programs, they're used for all parts of a film and television industry. Big international productions often, but in domestic productions, domestic feature films, independent feature films are also just as kind of important users of production incentives to bring projects to fruition. And we're seeing this year an increasing focus within incentives on this part of the industry, and creating specific rules to target local feature film production in particular, and make sure that it's supported. So I've just got a few notable updates to run through. There have been many updates this year. This is just a selection for this presentation. I mentioned California. There was a major expansion this year, with lots and lots of discussion around that program. Ultimately, the budget has more than doubled to $750 million going forward, and that started on 1st of July this year. And so, yeah, it has a much larger budget and much more capacity. It's previously been quite capacity constrained, and there are lots of other kind of rules within the program that have been changed, including rates and rules on expenditure outside of Los Angeles. But one of the big changes as well is converting the program, or the model of the incentive, to a refundable tax credit. So previously, it was quite a difficult incentive to monetize for the users of the incentive. But by using this refundable tax credit model, it kind of brings this program in line with the UK, Ireland, and Australia, and lots of other kind of easily monetizable tax credit programs around the world. So some really big changes in California. Also in the US, there was a big expansion of the Texas incentive. So this is another kind of long-running program, but with the most recent changes that were approved earlier this year, there's now a budget of $300 million across 2 years, so about $150 million a year. There were changes to the kind of eligibility criteria for this program, making it a bit easier to be an eligible production. And there are also lots of new uplifts introduced for kind of targeted production behavior. So filming outside, regional filming or rural filming, I think featuring kind of Texas locations and heritage sites for doing post-production, and lots of other things. So there's kind of new uplifts to encourage certain production to happen. In Latin America, there's a new transferable tax credit that's been launched. This kind of follows the successful model in Colombia, and we're seeing this model being considered elsewhere in LATAM, which I'll come on to in a moment. But this is a 37% transferable tax credit, which means that you can, once you're issued the credits, you can sell them to other businesses or entities within Ecuador. And it's been a successful model in Colombia, and it's been, kind of used again in Ecuador. So we'll see how that works out. Um, in Ireland, there's now an enhanced incentive for lower budget film. So this is one of the incentives that I mentioned that's really trying to encourage lower budget feature film to be produced and to support those types of projects. So films with budgets under 20 million euros are now eligible for a 40% incentive in Ireland, whereas the kind of base incentive is 32%. So there's a pretty significant uplift for those projects. Another or two major expansions in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi and Jordan. So Abu Dhabi has moved to a 35% base incentive, and I think the value goes up to 50%. Jordan has a 25 to 45% incentive as of this year. And both of these have a kind of points-based uplift system. So there are lots of different ways that a production can kind of go to increase the incentive rate by, featuring certain locations or conducting kind of training work in the country. So there's lots of different ways that productions can get those uplifts, and you kind of score points for doing different things, and then the number of points affects the incentive rate. Finally, in terms of notable updates, New Zealand very recently updated the rules of its incentive. It now has an enhanced above the line allowance, so more of your above the line costs qualify for the incentive in New Zealand, and also the points-based uplift in New Zealand, which already existed, has been extended to also be available to post VFX and digital productions. Previously, it was only available if you were a physical production project. So it's a fairly kind of big expansion of that program as well in New Zealand. So next, I'm just going to touch on a few ongoing developments. So these are things that maybe have been announced or are currently being legislated, but just haven't, you can't use them today, but you'll be able to potentially use them soon. I will start with Qatar because it was the most recent. So over the weekend at the Doha Film Festival, Qatar announced a new 40% cash rebate with a 10% or up to 10% uplift is planned to launch in Q2 2026. So this is another rebate system that has a kind of an uplift with a range of different criteria. Some of them were covered in the announcement. It's things like using Qatari talent and conducting training in Qatar, and those sorts of things will be able to qualify you for this up to 10% uplift. This incentive also has a regional allowance, so you can spend some of your budget in other countries that will be confirmed, I think, closer to the launch. And those costs can actually qualify for the Qatar incentive up to 25% of your total qualifying costs. So that's the new Qatar incentive. I'll move on to Illinois, where there's new legislation that's been approved by the legislature. It's waiting for the governor's signature at the moment, but it would increase the incentive rate from 30% to 35% for local wages and local vendor spend. And it would also extend the incentive to, I think, to the end of 2038. And that's been, as I say, that's been approved by legislature, but just needs the governor's signature to come in. Nearby in Wisconsin, there's a new 30% transferable tax credit launching in 2026. So yes, this is another US state that's launching a program, and it's been legislated and everything. It's just it will be kind of effective from, I think, 1st of January next year. In Denmark, there's a new production incentive that's been announced and is currently being legislated. It will be a 25% cash rebate, and the it's been kind of agreed by government in terms of the model, but it's just going through the legislative process at the moment, and that is, I think, due to launch again on 1st of January next year. And so Denmark's one of the kind of final European countries to introduce a production incentive. And then finally, in terms of these ongoing developments, Peru passed a law this year for an incentive. It would be, again, one of these transferable tax credits, so similar to Colombia and similar to Ecuador. The incentive value is 29.5%, and it still needs regulations, and I think there's still a bit of work to be done. But the incentive law itself is effective from the start of next year, so hopefully we'll see that program get kind of it needs to be developed into kind of full regulations, and then it will be ready for productions to use. So that's a very there's a lot of information in a very short space of time, but those are some of the changes and updates that we're seeing. I will hand back to Gabriella for the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Joe. That was very in-depth. As you said, it's a lot of information to tackle in a short period of time. But I think one of the things that, you touched on a few US states, obviously, whose credits are expanding or they're developing new ones. And obviously, there's a lot of rumbling sort of in the industry, both around the tariffs, but also a potential US federal incentive program. So I was wondering what kind of insight or, you can offer on what that's going to look like for productions wanting to shoot in the States.
Yeah, so I think it was kind of earlier this year that the discussion started with tariffs, and then we've kind of seen the discussion at least change more to the idea of a federal tax credit. From our perspective, all of this is still at a fairly early stage. There's not too much detail available, but I think the proposal for the federal tax credit is kind of an expansion of an existing tax deduction scheme, and yeah, I think there's work being done on that, and we'll see if there's kind of more detail to come. Legislation has been introduced, but it's at a very early stage. I don't think it's been kind of discussed or negotiated or anything like that at this point. But obviously, it would have a kind of big effect on the US. Canada has a federal tax credit and then individual province incentives, so it would potentially there's kind of room for a similar model in the US where you have a federal program topped up or combined with states.
One of the things you mentioned briefly was some developments in sort of the Asia Pacific region, and I'm wondering what is that? There's obviously a lot of interest in shooting over there, and I think particularly you've seen Japan has a relatively still new incentive program. What's the sort of take that you guys have on how those incentives are functioning, and also what that region kind of has to offer in terms of international productions who are looking to shoot there?
So I think from our perspective, there's a lot of demand for filming in Asia, and there are now incentives kind of popping up in different countries. So I don't think it was kind of in the last year, but in the last few years, we've seen Japan introduce a new incentive, which has been used by international productions, and Korea has a kind of long-standing but fairly small incentive program that's been used again by some international productions. The real kind of established incentives in Asia, for at least for the kind of international market, are in. I'm thinking of Thailand, which has been really successful in that kind of locations side of the production market. So Japan and Korea obviously have kind of huge domestic industries that have, and there's other funding systems for those, and the incentives that have been introduced actually are just for international productions in those countries. But in Thailand, there's the incentive is more kind of long-standing at this point and has been updated on several occasions and is pretty competitive. And that program has had a lot of success, really. I think the Thailand incentive is maybe a bit more similar to some international competitors. So the rate is slightly lower, but the actual value that you can get from it is is higher. Japan, there's lots of there are quite a few caps and things involved, and Korea has a very low cap. So then, there's a lot of demand, so they're attracting some productions, but they're not necessarily kind of attracting productions in the way that other countries kind of
Mm,
use incentives to get to attract kind of a broader production market.
mm,
So there's, we're watching it closely, and there seems to be lots happening there.
yeah.
I think that's one of the areas in the world where there's still lots of room for policy development.
It leads on to one of the other things you sort of discussed when we were planning this, which is, incentives come and go and they change and they pause. And so it's interesting to note, how does a region develop an incentive with a view for longevity, both financially, how it's able to continue to fund the incentive, but also managing an influx of production when they get such, when you launch a really attractive incentive and then all of a sudden there's a lot of interest, how a region can actually manage an incentive in the long term. So, what would you say would be sort of your insight into how a region can develop an incentive with an eye for that kind of longevity?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something that we kind of work on a lot as a company. I mean, the the incentives that really work around the world are those that have been in place for a long time, and have kind of built a degree of trust, both in the sense that like producers can, you know, potential producers can see that their predecessors have used the incentive successfully and things have gone relatively smoothly. Um, but there's a lot of complexity in planning productions, and what producers really want is to sort of know that at least this part of the process is fairly kind of um, low stress, and like can be relied on. So they're looking for kind of predictability and stability. Um, in terms of how you kind of build that into a policy, I think it's really about it's I think what producers are looking for, as I say, is the kind of something that's secure and fairly guaranteed. That the rules, the incentive works in the way that the rules describe. And so if that means that the things like the incentive rate is maybe lower, or there are caps, that's not always a kind of a negative thing if it means that the incentive is actually there and it does what it says on the tin. So we definitely see value in some of those kind of administrative controls and making sure that those are in place. The other thing is that there are lots of incentives are obviously part of how an industry grows, but there are kind of natural caps that we often see around the world. So there are smaller countries with very competitive incentives, but in terms of crew capacity and sound stages and things like that, if those aren't kind of as built out in major markets, then it's just the industry. It doesn't kind of grow far too quickly, kind of overnight. It does. An incentive can really help to kind of drive interest, but there's often a lot of other factors that kind of go into industry growth. So we don't tend to see too much kind of like overnight, you know,
Mm.
jumping in demand unless it's somewhere like maybe California where there's a lot of interest, but the incentive hasn't been kind of had the capacity to meet that interest.
And that's obviously a place where the crews and the sound stages and all that infrastructure is there and it's relied upon.
Yeah.
So those two things very much feed into each other. So one of the questions we've got from the chat is, can you speak to labor versus all spend on the new and expanding credits, and what is the trend overall?
So I mean, there are a few kind of labor only incentives. The ones I'm thinking of are in Canada, where the only costs that qualify for the incentive are labor costs. And that works in Canada because of the kind of stacking mechanism. So the actual kind of um, incentive rate in parts of Canada can be kind of above 50% when you kind of add everything up. But actually, because it only applies to labor, it kind of evens out at about the same level as a kind of lower headline rate, but all spend incentive. Um, I think there's no kind of right or wrong answer to these questions, but certainly from the perspective of the producer, they're thinking about the effective rate of an incentive. So if you have a really high headline rate, but it only applies to half of your budget, it's kind of worth the same amount as an incentive that's worth, you know, half the rate, but it applies to the whole budget, and so, um, you know, producers and studios are looking at all of these rules very closely. Um, so depending on how things are kind of designed, either option can work to kind of um, build demand and to build an industry.
Mm. Sort of feeding back into some of the questions that we've discussed and we've just had, we've been asked, are we seeing a shift from purely financial incentives to broader ecosystem-based strategies, which I think feeds nicely into the question we've just had.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, as I was saying, incentives, when we do sector strategy work, incentives are kind of a really key component of industry development and industry policy. But there are other important areas, and I think incentives are kind of the simplest and quickest actually to introduce, but the others kind of take a lot longer normally. So you can design an incentive and put it in place probably within kind of a year, but building infrastructure maybe takes a few years, and often the most long term is that kind of labor or workforce development, which can take however many years. But it's that thing of kind of training people up doesn't happen overnight and needs that kind of long term planning, which often is kind of done by or with the support of governments. Within incentives, we do see rules that aim to kind of bring that workforce development piece in. So some of the uplifts that I mentioned before in Texas and Abu Dhabi, and I think the upcoming incentive in Qatar, they're encouraging the users of the incentive, the productions, to kind of build training work into their project, and they get a kind of a small uplift for doing that work. Ireland for a long time has been the kind of gold standard here for having its kind of workforce development plan aspect built into the incentive, and producers can build their own plan. It's not kind of set in stone. You don't need to hire 20 trainees, but you could do that, or you could do something else, and you can kind of build your own plan in Ireland and submit that, and that kind of qualifies you for the incentive. And that's been, from our perspective, really successful, because it means that different production types can kind of do work that's kind of proportionate to their size, and also just kind of achievable, basically. So it's worked really well with that model.
I think that also kind of answers in a roundabout way what I'd spoken about before is, how do you create an incentive with longevity? And I think having that flexibility, like you've just mentioned, is a really big part of that. So we've hit our half-hour allotment quite quickly. So I think, unfortunately, that's all the questions we're going to be able to take, but I think we're going to send the recording around and hopefully be able to get some answers to some of the questions that have been in the chat as well. Joe, thank you so much. That was insightful as ever. And thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, I believe Olsberg will be in touch with some recordings and things like that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.